So what I'm going to do today is I want to use something that I have been thinking about for a while to respond to, but also to supplement and build on some of Bob's work. And it's nice for me that Bob recently wrote something on Schelling, because that's what I work on. So I want to respond to Bob's 2023 paper on Schelling freedom and evil in the EJP. So when Bob was writing that paper, we had a bit of a back and forth discussion. And particularly in the process of him in the paper and in our conversations, explaining how he understood my reading of Schelling's account of freedom in the Freedom Essay, I realised that the way that I think about Schelling's account of freedom has developed in particular ways, but I hadn't actually ever written that down. So Bob was probably representing really well the version of the view that I'd actually published, but not representing the version of the view that lived inside my head, which is fair enough, because he had no reason to know about that version of it. So where Bob and I thought that we disagreed, I thought that we pretty much agreed. So part of what I want to do in response to Bob's paper is to clarify my own account of Schelling's conception of freedom in the Freedom Essay. I want to say that Bob and I are actually broadly in agreement on a lot of the central claims of that paper. He takes us to diverge on one of the really key points. I think we kind of agree, but that our preferred terminology is different, which means our emphasis is different. I also think that there are some areas where Bob's arguments can actually be strengthened a little bit if we bring in some considerations from the rest of Schelling's work. So one thing that I think, for better for worse, in this paper is that Bob's focus is quite narrow, which is fine. But I think that there's more we can do if we bring in some wider aspects of Schelling's work. So I want to argue that Bob does solve the puzzle that he sets out to solve in the paper, but I think there's still something lacking in his account, because, as I'm going to argue, it still entails the need to make sense of a conception of choice that's at issue in the Freedom Essay, which, as we were just talking about, right, Bob maybe isn't fussed about, but I'm going to say he should be, or at least I am, I guess. So this is where the second thing comes in. I have been thinking about and on and off trying to actually seriously work on something for quite a while on a reading of Schelling as entailing some kind of perfectionism or virtue ethics. My preferred term would be ethics of flourishing, for reasons I will not have time to get into. I think that those are broadly the same kind of approach to ethics. So even though ethics of flourishing is my preferred term, I'm going to use virtue ethics because it's quicker to say, and because hopefully everyone will have a kind of general sense of what is involved in a virtue ethics type view. So I think that virtue ethics-esque account is something that we can read out of Schelling, and I think we can also use it as a lens to help us understand certain concepts in Schelling's philosophy, in particular this conception of choice in the Freedom Essay. So I am going to use that virtue ethics-esque reading and argue it can help us make sense of this notion of choice that I think Bob doesn't do. And there's just been something really nice for me working on this paper, the way that these two areas have come together, the kind of perfectionism stuff and the Freedom Essay stuff. So the way that even me starting to take perfectionism seriously is due to Bob, and the way that I think about it is in a large part due to conversations with Bob, and Bob and I worked together on my thesis on the Freedom Essay, which is what prompted Bob to go back, and we did a reading group on the Freedom Essay, right? And so it was kind of working with me on that led Bob to think about these things. So it's just lovely, isn't it? It's just a really nice, lovely thing. Before I get into the paper, I'll just give a small caveat / Bob-related autobiographical tangent. You will notice there is no Hegel in this paper. So my apologies for that. Probably not the right crowd to admit this to, but I've always been more into Schelling than Hegel. But obviously I have time for Hegel. When I first approached Bob with my PhD project, it was going to be a project on Schelling and Hegel, looking at their different conceptions of system and freedom. But not that far into my first year, I had to break the news to Bob that there was not going to be any Hegel. I decided to ditch Hegel, and it was just going to be Schelling. And Bob was obviously really amazing about that. I was so nervous about telling him that was going to happen. So in a nice bit of, I don't know, some kind of parallel, when Stephen invited me to speak today, he said, obviously you can talk about Schelling, but it's the Hegel Society, like it's cool if you can bring in some Hegel. And I said, absolutely, I can bring in some Hegel. And I did fully intend to do that at the time, but this is now me breaking the news to you as I broke the news to Bob all those years ago. There is no Hegel. There will only be Schelling. Okay, cool. So it's a bit more of a focused account of what I'm going to do structure-wise today. I feel like there's a lot going on. Hopefully there's not too much going on. We'll see. So I'll give a brief bit of background on the freedom essay for anyone who's not familiar with the text. Outline Bob's arguments in his paper, Schelling on Freedom, Evil and Imputation, a puzzle. I'm also going to note some additional supporting reasons for some of Bob's arguments there. I want to say, as I said, that Bob and I converge on his central claim, but I want to draw attention to the fact that we do diverge on what we would term this kind of view. So Bob describes Schelling's account of freedom in this text as an essentialist conception of freedom. I'm going to argue that that is an accurate description of Schelling's account of freedom in general, but in the case of specifically human freedom, it kind of gives way to what I think looks more like an existentialist account of freedom. So I want to argue that Bob is successful in his aim to solve this puzzle that he sets out, but I want to say there's still a gap to be filled on his view because he doesn't give a substantive account of the notion of choice in the freedom essay. His claim is that he doesn't need to. I'm going to say that he does, or at the very least, we should want to, basically. So I'm then going to move on to outline a way that I think we should think about that choice using this virtue ethics-esque account. And what I'm going to argue is that it's going to necessitate a very different way of thinking about choice than we generally do. And I'm going to suggest a useful way we can do that is to use this concept that I'm borrowing from Schelling's Naturphilosophy, which is the concept of exhibition. Cool. So, freedom essay. If you're not familiar with it, I'm going to very, very, very briefly say some things about it. If you're not familiar with it, I would absolutely recommend that you read it. It's confusing, it's beautiful, it's really, really rich. I've been reading it for about 15 years non-stop, and I'm not bored of it, and it's really short. So, in the freedom essay, amongst other things, Schelling is interested in the problem of evil in two forms. So the first form is the traditional problem of evil, right? How is it that evil is possible without this threatening something about the nature of God? So I have argued elsewhere that this is a way in for Schelling to thinking about questions about part-whole relations, right? So how is it that genuine freedom or novelty is possible at the level of a part of nature without that threatening the systematic coherence of nature as a whole? There's also a second version of the problem of evil that Schelling is worried about here, which we might call the post-Kantian version of the problem of evil. So this is the question of how can we impute evil actions to an agent if the rational agent is always going to choose the good? So that second version is less important for what I'm going to talk about today, but I think it's worth just mentioning because those worries about evil becoming some kind of just privation or lack of reason are very much an issue for Schelling. So that familiar worry that on Kant's account, the person that's choosing evil isn't exercising reason, so they're not really exercising agency or freedom. That's a big deal for Schelling. Okay, so the question, as I would read the freedom essay, is, given that human beings are part of the system of nature, and given that that entails that their essences are in some sense specified by nature as a whole, how is it that humans are able to make choices of the kind which enable their actions to be imputable to them? That's a big question. And Schelling's answer, very briefly, is that the essence of human beings is so indeterminate that all our essence specifies is the fact that we are the kinds of beings that have to make a choice between good and evil. So our essence specifies that we have to choose, but what we choose is always down to the particular individual agent. So the problem of evil is solved, apparently. Whether you think that's a good solution or not is another question. So God or the whole necessitates that there is a choice to be made, but each individual human agent is the maker of her own particular choice. That choice is therefore imputable to the agent. It's not God's fault, it's your fault. I've presented that in the kind of language that I read the freedom essay in, which not everybody necessarily agrees with in the literature, but that structurally, that account of how the problem of evil is solved is pretty much the accepted account in the literature. So that's what Bob calls the standard reading. But the way Schelling talks about choice here becomes quite murky. So Schelling claims that this isn't one particular choice, which we make in our finite lifetimes, but it's a choice which he describes as atemporal or eternal. It's one that agent makes outside of time, which somehow specifies the content of her essence, such that there's a necessity of actions that follow from this essence that's like atemporally freely chosen. Hopefully that's clear enough. As you can imagine, a lot of the literature is focused on how we should think about this atemporal, like, grounding choice, right? Okay, but hopefully it's clear enough the way that this account is meant to, which, is it forward button? There we go. Yeah, the way that this account secures the imputability of actions to agents. And that's what Bob is worried about, right? Evil and imputation. So this is how Bob summarizes the standard reading in his paper. So freedom is necessary for imputation. Freedom requires a choice between options. We have the atemporal option to choose between a good or evil essence. Therefore, if we have an evil essence, this can be imputed to us. So on this standard view, the agent's choice between good and evil is constitutive of freedom. That's what freedom is on the standard view. And that's what makes imputing choice to that choice to the agent possible. So Bob basically raises a concern for this standard reading, which is interpretive and systematic. Have I got this? No. So the interpretive worry that Bob raises is, so I'm citing Bob here, Schelling seems to clearly deny that choice is a necessary or sufficient condition for freedom, using some fairly standard arguments against so-called indifferentism, or what Schelling calls here the equilibriist. So Schelling's worry here that Bob picks up on is essentially that on an indifferentist picture of freedom as choice, the agent's motivations aren't accounted for, because on this kind of view, only the agent and not any reasons account for the agent's action. So we get this kind of weird picture that, like, Schelling just thinks it's kind of completely ridiculous, and I think Bob is with him here, right? That, and maybe this relates to the Vauquer stuff, that there's a sense in which on this kind of picture, the agent just has to, like, step back and will, like, based on pretty much nothing. So Schelling says, like, the agent would either just have to, like, stay in indifference just forever, or just do something that's completely arbitrary. So for Schelling, that's just not what freedom should look like, right? And he's very, very disparaging about this particular view, indifferentist view of freedom as choice. So this leads to what Bob calls the systematic worry, which is that Schelling's rejection of indifferentism demonstrates that this kind of choice-based account can't be what freedom is for Schelling, right? But the standard view seems to hold that freedom is constituted by choice. So Bob argues that view just can't be right. Like, the view in the literature that Schelling is giving us an account of freedom as constituted by choice just is implausible, given that Schelling is really clearly rejecting a particular account of freedom as choice. There's also a further element of Schelling's discussions in the freedom essay that Bob highlights that indicates that choice can't be the defining feature of freedom for Schelling. And this is going to become important when I talk about my virtue ethics-esque account later, because I take it this is a feature of something virtue ethics-y. So this is Schelling's claim that in moral cases, the virtuous agent doesn't actually genuinely choose between two options. That idea that there's a real choice there is problematic. So for Schelling, when the virtuous agent acts, she's not really faced with a decision between two options. And Bob uses the example of lying and telling the truth. So for the virtuous agent, lying just isn't really an open option, right? As a virtuous person, she just has the character that necessitates what she's going to do is tell the truth. Like, there isn't a deliberation here. Oh my God, what should I do? She's virtuous. Like, she doesn't lie. That's just what happens, right? Telling the truth just is what a virtuous person would do. So Schelling has this focus on necessity in free action, which also seems to count against reading him as seeing freedom as constituted by choice. Okay, so this indifferentist option is out. So Bob then turns to what he identifies as the usual alternative to indifferentism, which is intellectualism, and argues that that's also going to be ruled out based on other arguments Schelling makes in the text. So Bob uses Schelling's rejection of Leibniz's position on creation here as his example. So the intellectualist view then is the claim that the agent's actions are determined by reasons. So on this view, the agent kind of doesn't really make a choice because it's the reason which she acts on which determines her action. So Schelling's critique of Leibniz's account of creation, which he takes as seeing God's choice to create the world in these intellectualist terms, Schelling essentially wants to argue that that would make God unfree. So if God created nature based on the fact it was rational to do so, then God isn't free, right? Because that action is necessitated by a reason which is external to God. I want to also, do I want to say that? No. Right, I want to draw attention briefly to another feature of Schelling's critique of Leibniz here, which again I think supports my argument that we can see something virtue ethics-esque going on in Schelling. So Schelling wants to argue that God's act of creating nature was necessary, but not because it was necessitated by reason, as he takes it to be the case in Leibniz's account. Rather, Schelling argues it was necessary because of the kind of being that God is, right? Because of God's character or personality, essentially. And this notion of personality is important in the freedom essay. So I think, again, we can see something which looks similar to this account, virtue ethics-esque account of a virtuous agent, right? So for Schelling, God doesn't make a genuine choice about whether to create nature or not. God would always create nature, but not because of a reason which is independent of God. God creates nature by necessity because that's the character of God as a being, right? And that's the sense for Schelling in which creation is a free action. So although it's possible in the metaphysical sense that God would just not create nature, and Schelling's really clear about that, I think, it could have just not happened. It's not possible that a being that has the personality that God has would not create nature, right? So this is a notion of necessity which is not grounded in reason. It's not grounded in a restriction of metaphysical possibility. It's a necessity which is grounded in character or personality. Okay, you might think here, this is God's freedom, right? Like we're talking about human freedom. But as I'm going to keep coming back to, because this is a really important point for a lot of what I want to say, for Schelling, the freedom of humans, and indeed the freedom of any other being in nature, is structurally the same as the freedom of God, right? The difference here between all forms of freedom is a difference of degree. It's not a difference in kind. And this, I think, is part of Schelling's account, which really comes into view when we consider his broader philosophical commitment. So freedom for Schelling is a type of natural process. Everything is, right? And therefore, like any other type of natural process, it's structurally the same at all levels of nature, whether it's the freedom of humans, God, any other part of nature. And this is important, I think, and again, I'm going to come back to this later, because whatever account of freedom we have for human freedom, the freedom of God, it has to be applicable to all of those levels in a particular way. It has to help us make sense of all those different types of freedom. Okay, so back to Bob. So given that indifferentism and intellectualism have been ruled out, Bob argues that Schelling must be arguing for some kind of middle third position, like very familiar strategy from this kind of period. Schelling loves to do it, find that sneaky third option. And Bob argues we can identify some necessary features of what Schelling's view needs to look like based on his rejection of the other accounts. So we know that there must be something which motivates action. It can't be this indifferentist, like baseless willing kind of view, right? But the motivation for action can't be a reason which is external to the agent. So Bob argues that the motivation for action must be something which follows from the character of the agent. Oh, hold on, I'm not there yet, sorry. I keep forgetting just how scant my slides are, apologies. So Bob cites Schelling here, saying that this third view conceives of action as, and this is Schelling, an inner necessity springing from the essence of the acting individual itself. Now, going into details of how this account is spelled out in the freedom essay is kind of out of the scope of Bob's paper. He does talk about it briefly, and I'm also going to talk about it very briefly, because what I think it's important to note is that it's structurally the same as the account that Schelling uses for the creation of nature. So again, that sameness of process at all levels comes out here, right? So Schelling uses the Kabbalistic idea of an internal contraction. It's a kind of self-limitation. Again, that's hopefully going to be a familiar idea to scholars of this period, even if you haven't read the Freedom Essay. So the idea is that in creating nature, God kind of self-limits, right? Creation is a particular manifestation of God's essence, which is also a limitation of God's essence, right? But it's a limitation which is necessary for existence. So it's not a problematic form of limitation. It's a limitation which is positive and it's productive. It's the limitation that allows for self-positing, essentially, right? So that then is kind of transposed onto Schelling's account of human freedom. There we go, finally ready for it. So this is Bob. So on this view of freedom, what the agent does is governed by some kind of determinacy which is necessary, but this does not restrict or limit the nature of the agent, as it's only in this way that the nature or essence of the agent is properly realised. So that same like limitation, self-positing stuff. In this manner, Schelling can argue freedom involves not arbitrariness or choice, but necessity, in a way that's still internal to the agent and hence non-coercive, and thus in a way that remains free in a manner that intellectualism does not. Let's call this conception of freedom as necessitation from essence, or essentialist freedom for short. Right, I'm actually going to quote Bob again. So, on this account, the agent does not need alternative possibilities to be free. I actually want to add here, because I think this is really important, that on Schelling's account, this is alternative possibilities at that level of like genuine options for the agent that's being denied here. So for Schelling, the nature of nature is such that the future is always open. So there are alternative possibilities at the metaphysical level. So the notion of alternative possibilities that I would argue is being denied here is that idea that there is actually more than one option that that particular agent would choose. I think that's really important element of Schelling's view that doesn't really come out on Bob's account here. Okay, yeah, so choice is not required for freedom, nor is the agent determined to act by reasons that lie beyond themselves in a way that constrains them from outside. Rather, they act freely by acting in accordance with their own essence or nature. So, this is Bob's reading, Essentialist freedom. So, Bob then sets out to answer a bunch of questions about this reading. In particular, where does it leave us in terms of thinking about good and evil, and where does it leave us with respect to imputation? Because that's the things that Bob is worried about here. So, Bob argues that Schelling's claims about the nature of the human essence are key here. Unsurprisingly, because his is an essentialist conception of freedom, right? And also, Schelling is very clear that the nature of the human essence is important for what human freedom looks like. I'm not going to read all of these out, I don't think. But yeah, Schelling is really clear in the text with this claim that the essence of humans is that we are the beings that are faced with this choice between good and evil, right? Man is an undetermined entity. He alone can determine himself. Man's been placed on the summit where he has to choose. Sorry, I guess I was assuming running through those there that you're as familiar with them as I am, but maybe not. I'll leave them up there. But Schelling is very clear that humans have this kind of undetermined essence, like we have to choose between good and evil. And this is Bob's claim, right? That it's that structure of the human essence which is constitutive of freedom. It's not the choice itself. So the essence of humans necessitates the fact that we have to choose, and that's what freedom is. The choice isn't freedom, it's the fact that the structure of our essence means we have to choose. In a sense, this is a classic Bob argument. Like, it seems really simple. When I give you the argument, it seems really simple. It's super insightful. I think it's very characteristic of Bob's way of doing philosophy. And when I read it, I thought, oh, he's just right, isn't he? Okay, so it follows that our essence, qua self-positing beings, is our capacity to choose, and freedom consists in acting in accordance with our essence, not in the choice as such. Thus, there is nothing free about choice in itself, and freedom consists in realizing one's essence, but in our case, we're faced by both good and evil options as part of our nature. This choice, therefore, constitutes freedom for us, but not on indifferentist grounds, which claim that freedom simply is choice, but on essentialist grounds, which claim that freedom is realizing our essence. And in this case, to be faced with this choice is our essence. So in making the choice, we're free in essentialist terms, not in indifferentist ones. Isn't that good? It's really good. I love it. Yeah, really simple, super effective. So we get an account of freedom which avoids relying on the conception of choice, right? But as you can see from this quotation, choice is still figuring pretty heavily in this account, I would say, right? So freedom itself isn't constituted by choice, but by the necessity that we do make a choice, right? So Bob solves his puzzle, right? Freedom isn't reliant on choice. Well done, Bob. Puzzle is solved. But I think there's still very much a notion of choice that we would want to make sense here. We need to talk about that, right? Like our freedom necessitates we must make a choice. So what's going on with the choice? How does Bob tackle this in the paper? Essentially, he kind of does and he doesn't. So he acknowledges that there's still a worry about choice here because, you know, whether an agent's good or evil still comes out as being a matter of this radical choice. But he follows Gardner. I wasn't going to read that either necessarily. So this is the claim that, like, the inability to understand this choice is that we should look at it as a feature of Schelling's account rather than a problem with the account. So the idea is that if we can think about Schelling's aim here as trying to capture the fact that this choice is made for no reason or is somehow beyond reason, right? And if that's the case, then we kind of shouldn't be able to understand the choice. We're trying to understand it in rational terms, but it's sort of pre-rational somehow, right? But Bob says, look, even if this account doesn't give us a way to understand the agent's choice, that's okay because we still get imputation, right? Because choices appear as such to the agent acts in accordance with her essence, so we know she acts freely, so we get imputation. It's cool. We can hold people responsible for the stuff that they do. Okay, so just a quick summary of Bob's view, I guess. So the starting point is this thought that choice cannot be constitutive of freedom. Because Schelling has a number of arguments against this indifferentist idea of freedom as choice. So the solution is to say freedom is not constituted by choice, it's constituted by acting in accordance with essence. So there's necessitation here, but it's internal necessitation. So if an agent acts in accordance with her essence, she's free, her actions are imputable, everything's good. And that is all good, I think, and it's right, I think. But I just think there are at least two places where we still need to think about choice. Like, I just can't accept that we don't need to think about that. So one is that there's still this conception of choice at play here, right? Like, oh God. If freedom is acting in accordance with essence, but if the only thing that's contained in the human essence is that we have to make a choice, like, how can we make sense of that choice? Schelling and Bob are both really clear about that. Like, our essence, all it specifies that we have to choose. So, like, how do we make sense of that? We might also think that there is a further question about the structure of choice in our everyday lives, or at least about the things that we understand as choices, because there definitely are things we understand as choices, right? Like, how do those choices play out? How do they relate to this radical choice between good and evil that maybe we can't explain? And this final question about everyday choices, I think it's really important. And I think it's basically missed in pretty much all of the literature on the freedom essay. Like, nobody seems fussed about what everyday choices look like and how they relate to this radical choice. It's all like, what does it mean to choose atemporally? Which is a great question, by the way. Like, what does it mean? And I think it's really important for this reason. So Schelling is insistent, I think, throughout his philosophical career that things like essence, the whole, God, etc., do not have an existence separate or above actually existing nature from their instantiations, right? We can separate them out in abstraction, but that just is not how being is structured for Schelling, I think, right? So even in abstraction for Schelling, there's no logical priority of like essence over existence, God over nature, the whole over the parts, because each of those terms only gets its actuality like in and through the other one, essentially. So I think we really do need to understand an everyday notion of choice as well as the radical like atemporal notion of choice, because they're going to have that reciprocal relationship, right? So for Schelling, I think in order to understand essence, you have to understand form, and vice versa. In order to understand the whole, you have to understand the parts, and vice versa. If you want to understand God, you've got to understand nature, and vice versa. You can see the pattern here, right? So in order to understand this radical choice, I think you're going to have to understand an everyday notion of choice, because they're going to have that reciprocity. And that even comes out, I think, there's this little section in this quote from the freedom essay, which everybody ignores, this bit here. Moreover, it does not precede life in time, but occurs throughout time. So there's all this stuff about like atemporal choice, it happens, the agent makes it, it's really radical. And then there's this little bit, it occurs throughout time. So like, I think even in the Schelling, we get this sense of like, you know, he's focusing on this radical first act, or first is the wrong word, but whatever. But there is still this sense that like there's a temporal element to it too, right? So I think we just need to make sense of that. So yeah, I think Bob's right in a lot of ways, but I think the account needs to go further essentially to help us understand that way of thinking about choice. But I think Bob is right in that this is important, is that if we're going to think about this notion of choice, we have to make sure it doesn't come out as being that kind of indifferentist conception of choice that Schelling is worried about. Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, and I think one thing that I want to do, which I think is always important with Schelling, is to bring in like these other considerations from his philosophy, right? And those, yeah, so his philosophical project, and even in this text really explicitly, Schelling is not just worried about giving an account of freedom, he's worried about giving an account of nature and an account of freedom within nature as a whole, not just human freedom and evil and those kinds of things. And I think hopefully from those comments about the structure of like essence and form, the whole and the parts, and how that maps onto radical choice, you can kind of see why it's important to think about the wider claims that he's making here. Cool, so I think Bob's right. It's not choice that's constitutive of freedom. It can't be because of the reasons that Bob identifies in Schelling. So I would agree, we've got an essentialist conception of freedom, not a choice-based one. I think there's also a further reason, which I kind of mentioned earlier, why freedom can't be constituted by choice for Schelling that Bob doesn't identify. And that's because for Schelling, as I've said, human freedom is one specific example of a kind of agency that exists throughout nature. And for Schelling, agency is therefore a natural process, so it has to have the same structure throughout these different levels of nature. This is a really fundamental claim in the nature philosophy, and it's also a claim which is made in the freedom essay, right? So human freedom, although it has peculiarities which make it unique in a really important sense, in another really important sense, it's just one example of the freedom that exists in varying degrees throughout the whole of nature. So when we think about freedom in that way, I think it becomes even clearer that choice can't be what constitutes freedom, right? So although it might make sense to think about humans and maybe some other non-human animals as making choices, when we start thinking about grains of sand and rocks and weather systems and nature as a whole as making choices, like, we just don't really have a conception of choice that meaningfully applies to those other types of natural product. So that's why I think if we're talking about freedom in general, Bob is right to say Schelling's account of freedom is an essentialist account, right? All natural products exhibit freedom by virtue of the fact they act according to this inner necessity. They act accordance with their essence. This is like Schelling's kind of bit of Spinozism coming out here, right? That's what freedom is. Everything's exhibiting it all the time. Great. So Bob and I are in absolute agreement there, right, if we're talking about freedom in general. But Schelling in the freedom essay and Bob in this paper are focused on a specific type of freedom. They're focused on human freedom, right? Hence the title of the freedom essay, Investigations into the Nature of Human Freedom. And that tells us two things, right? One is that there are other types of freedom. Two is that we're talking about human freedom here, like that's our focus. So although for Schelling, human freedom is an instance of that same natural process as other forms of freedom, it's still unique. There is something about humans that makes our form of freedom different. We're the only kinds of beings that make this choice between good and evil, right? So we need to know what is it that makes that difference? Like, what is different about humans such that their freedom, although it's an instance of this universal natural process, takes that specific form? And if Bob and I are right, freedom for Schelling is about the relationship between an agent and essence, we need to look at what Schelling says about human essence. And as I've said, Schelling is really clear about this, right? Humans are the only beings that are responsible for the entire content of their essences, right? Humans are the only beings, that can determine themselves, like they have to make this choice. So their essence is determined by their choice, is essentially Schelling's claim here, right? So this is why when we get to human freedom, I think this essentialist account becomes something like an existentialist account, right? Because all that the essence of the agent contains for Schelling is the fact that we must choose. So I would take that to be an existentialist claim, right? In the case of humans, choice determines essence. That sounds like existentialism to me. But this is where I think this is kind of a matter of terminology, because I would understand existentialism to be a form of essentialism, right? In existentialism, essence determines action, but essence is determined by action, right? So it's a claim, existentialism is still a claim about essence, so I would take it to be a form of essentialism. It just depends what side of the coin you're emphasizing, essentially. So yeah, I think what we have in the freedom essay is an essentialist account of freedom in general, which gives way to an existentialist account of human freedom. Cool. How am I doing for time?
It's coming up to 20 past 4.
What does that mean?
We are going to finish at 5, but we can go over for up to 10 minutes.
What time did we actually start?
We started more or less on time, about 33 past.
Oh God, okay, cool. Okay, that's cool.
Maybe carry on for 10.
Yeah. Okay, wicked, cool. So, yeah, we'll see how it goes. So, okay, so hopefully with this existentialist stuff on the table, the reason why I think we need to understand choices becomes even more important, right? Like choice is obviously playing a big role here, I think. So this is where I want to say we can use something virtue ethics-esque. Hopefully, like from what I've said, you can see some of the reasons why I think that there is this kind of account coming out of some of Schelling's comments. Like, I haven't got / had time to give like all the evidence where I think this comes out of Schelling, but hopefully you can get the sense that there's some of that stuff going on, right? And so I think that kind of virtue ethics-esque way of thinking about the fact that choices are part of what an agent does, but what constitutes freedom or like ethical action on that kind of view isn't individual choices, but it's about kind of the ability of an agent to structure their lives according to a particular like aesthetic, I would want to call it. So I guess I would want to do something similar to Bob's argument here and say like, we can say that what constitutes freedom for humans is this ability to structure our lives according to a certain ideal or a certain aesthetic, right? In the way that a virtuous agent or any kind of agent does, right? And that aesthetic then becomes the basis that your life is structured, and it becomes something you use to justify actions. Now, obviously you could press that and say, sure, like that's cool, but there's still choices that are involved in that, right? Either individual choices that make up a particular way of living as an agent, or your choice of like your aesthetic or ideal you're going to use to structure your life. And yes, I want to say that's true. There kind of are choices involved, but actually I think when we attend to what it takes to live in a certain way, like on this virtue ethics-esque picture, and also on what I want to say could be Schelling's picture or my picture using Schelling, however you want to look at it, is that there are choices involved, but there's something going on which is more than those choices. And crucially, that this is really not that problematic indifferentist conception of choice that Schelling rejects. So this is one of my favorite examples of what I think we can say is going on here, right? Which is being a vegetarian. So being a vegetarian is not just one choice to be a vegetarian, right? Because just choosing to be a vegetarian on its own without actually carrying out any of the subsequent actions that are consistent with that choice just doesn't work, right? But conversely, those particular actions over time are also not enough to be a vegetarian, right? Consistently, like picking the mushroom risotto over the steak doesn't make someone a vegetarian. Like that individual series of actions, however consistent they are, only constitute being a vegetarian within the context of a commitment to a particular way of living, which itself is only actualized by performing that series of actions that are consistent with it. So like being a vegetarian is not just one choice at the level of ideals or a series of particular choices at the level of temporal action. It's both like a commitment to exhibit a particular way of living and the actual exhibition of that way of life, right? And the reciprocal action between those two levels. So I think this can kind of map onto the way that we can think about this like atemporal choice and individual choices on Schelling's account. And I think it also fits with this idea of the agent not really making choices in her moral actions and this necessity that comes with choices. So although there's a steak and there's chicken wings and there's pate, whatever on the menu, like they're just not genuine possibilities for the vegetarian, right? They are genuine possibilities in the sense that the future is metaphysically open. Like the kitchen has the ingredients, the chef knows how to make it. If you order a steak, that's what you get, right? But they're just not possibilities for someone like delineated in the form of life that a vegetarian is exhibiting, right? Yeah, I will say that quickly. And I think also when we think about this kind of example, it can capture a little bit of that claim that Bob, like following Gardner, makes in the paper about those kinds of choices being like sort of beyond reason in some way, right? Like there are reasons which count in favor of being a vegetarian. There's also reasons that count against it. And there's some kind of like circularity to how those reasons work, right? So which reasons are actually motivating to an agent only really come into view from within that particular form of life. So there's a kind of circularity here in the justification and the motivation of reasons. And hopefully you can see this example, like it shows that kind of reciprocity between the different registers I was talking about earlier, right? You've got this kind of conceptual or ideal level, being a vegetarian, and the temporal level of like acting like a vegetarian, right? And we need both, right? They're co-determining, they're codependent. There isn't a one-way relationship of determination between one and the other. They're this two sides of the same coin type affair, right? And that's, again, the way that Schelling views this relationship between the real and ideal, nature and God, whatever. Cool. So hopefully you noticed in that example I started sneaking in the term exhibition, exhibiting a form of life. So something like vegetarianism, whatever it is, could be thought of as a particular way of life which is exhibited, right? You make an exhibition of it. Yeah, so I'll say a little bit more about this term exhibition. I am taking it from a later essay of Schelling's called Exhibition of the Process of Nature. And I've always just been really into that title and that terminology because for Schelling, nature itself is an exhibition of the process of nature, right? We've got nature as process and nature as product. Two sides of that same nice coin again. So nature is an exhibition of the process of nature. But also what Schelling is doing in that text as a text in Naturphilosophy is providing one specific exhibition of the process of nature, right? He's exhibiting the natural process, or that's what he's trying to do. And in a sense, like when the philosopher of nature or any philosopher is writing, they are giving one particular exhibition of the process of nature. That phrase is a real mouthful. I'm going to say it now about 5 more times in really quick succession. So if nature is an exhibition of the process of nature, every specific piece of nature is also an exhibition of the process of nature, right? So that applies to all natural products. Everything in nature is an exhibition of the process of nature. That's the last time, I think, hopefully. So nature is exhibited in a huge multitude of different ways, right? I think the potential exhibitions of nature are infinite for Schelling. I think that that's right. Maybe not, but I think so. And even for Schelling, natural products of the same type are going to be exhibiting the same type of process in really different ways, depending on like their temporal and geographical location, the very specific set of environmental factors they exist within. And I would want to say also to some extent dependent on their character or their personality. So we get this idea of like personality being important for the freedom of God, and there's places where Schelling talks about there being personality within nature as a whole, right? So like all waterfalls are exhibiting the natural process which constitutes a waterfall, but each waterfall is also exhibiting that specific natural process of waterfall, right? Jones was talking about this with horses, right? Like horses are different guys, like they're all exhibiting the natural process of horse, but they are different, right? Like some cats are scatty and weird, like some cats are really lazy, some cats are super friendly. So there is a general exhibition of a particular form of life, but within that, for Schelling, I think, there are also more specific exhibitions of particular ways of living within that form of life. Remind me how long we said I had left? Not very long.
Up to maximum 14 minutes.
What, from now?
Yeah.
Oh, that's ages. Okay.
Ideally.
Ideally less. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, cool. That is absolutely fine. Let's see if I need to say any of this, basically. Yeah, we can skip out some naturphilosophy stuff. I guess what I want to say is that there's a kind of account that Schelling has in the Naturphilosophy which comes back in the freedom essay. And again, I think, despite the fact Schelling at the beginning says, my account in this text is only possible on the basis of the Naturphilosophy, which I've already worked out, a lot of Schelling scholars just seem to think, oh, freedom essay is its own thing. It's not its own thing. It's like an extension of Naturphilosophy, if you ask me. So we get this account in the Naturphilosophy of Schelling talking about the different possibilities for creativity which exist at different levels of nature. And this is all to do with like balance of reproductive drive and sensibility and all that like fun stuff. But essentially for Schelling, we have this kind of gradient, right, that goes throughout nature where the more sensibility and therefore creativity a being has, the more ways within that particular form of life individual beings are able to exhibit their particular form of life, right? So there's not that many ways to be a blade of grass. There's more ways to be a cat than there is to be a blade of grass. There's more ways to be a human than there is to be a cat. That's a very quick version of what I was going to talk about for a lot longer. But hopefully that kind of makes sense, right? And Schelling then kind of builds on that with his account of freedom in the freedom essay, right? So we get this claim about why human freedom is unique. In the nature philosophy, Schelling's already said, like, human beings have the greatest potential for creativity. We can preserve ourselves as individuals against nature in more of a range of ways than other beings, because that's what human reason gives us, and that's really cool. And we then get added to that this claim about human essence being so indeterminate that all it contains is the fact that we must choose, right? So we get this claim that humans have this kind of radical ability to exhibit forms of life which are completely our responsibility in a way that isn't the case for forms of life of other beings. And it's that which entails that humans are capable of this unique exhibition of the process of nature, which is evil, right? So what I think we have in exhibition is a version of the process which Schelling sets out as existing at all levels of nature, right? It's this process of like co-determination of essence and form, wholes and parts, blah, 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 which I tried to like make a little bit abstract when I was talking about vegetarianism. So there's a particular form of exhibition which a being is committed to, and then its actions kind of are the exhibition of that, right? In a conversation with Anthony Bruno, he suggested this really nice terminology to me about this. So like, it's a terminology of positing and depositing, right? So through their actions, the agent like posits themselves as a particular type of agent, right? You posit yourself as a vegetarian when you perform the actions that are consistent with vegetarianism. And those actions are then somehow, that positing is deposited into your like essence in some way, right? So there's this like reciprocal relationship between everyday acts like the positing of that form of life and that form of life itself, right? And it goes both ways. So I think that terminology is really nice to get that kind of like bootstrappy circularity, reciprocity that I've been talking about. Hopefully that's clear enough. I have got a couple of nice examples, which I'm not going to talk about, but I think there's a lot of examples of that same structure that I've been talking about throughout Schelling's work, as we should expect if that is the natural process, right? And it is for Schelling, I think. And I think we also see this, so for example, when in Schelling's account of the creation of a work of art, like the relationship between nature and the artist in the creation of art, follows this same kind of structure. And I think using that example, again, you can see how this would map onto an account of ethical life, right, or just general life. So I'm not going to go into those examples. There's another nice one from the Letters on Dogmatism and Criticism, but I will not talk about that. We can afterwards if you want to. So I will just say briefly what I think we get if we use this concept of exhibition to think about action and freedom. So I think we can accept Bob's conclusion that freedom is not constituted by choice for Schelling, it's constituted by acting in accordance with essence. But I think we also can get a way to make sense of how it is that human freedom involves this really radical responsibility for our own essences, right? We're the types of beings whose essence is like flexible to the extent we have the greatest degree of control over it, right? So that's what I think in the case of human freedom, the essentialist account turns into something like an existentialist account. Also, I think this way of thinking about it allows us to make sense of how everyday actions fit into the picture, right? Because they're the way that essence is exhibited and our form of life is posited through this like reciprocal interaction between essence and everyday action. And I think that's really important. Some people don't think it's important, but I think that those people are wrong. Yeah. We also avoid this idea of a kind of baseless willing, right? Because actions flow from the form of life the agent is exhibiting, which is internal to the agent. And it is kind of bootstrappy and circular, but like I'm a Schellingian, so I don't mind. And you guys are Hegelians, so maybe you don't mind. Well, I assume you guys are, some of you guys are. So hopefully you guys don't mind either. But I do think, again, like intuitively, if we think about the way that we do live our lives and the particular ways that reasons come into view and the actions and forms of life are like sort of reciprocally justifying, it seems legit to me. Yeah, so we avoid that kind of baseless willing idea because we have got something which justifies action. But it's something which is internal to the agent, right? It's coming from their essence or their particular form of life that they are exhibiting as a being. So we avoid those problems with indifferentism and intellectualism. And we also, and again, I think this is really important, have an account of freedom and agency which applies to the whole of nature. So using this concept of exhibition, we're able to make sense of that structural similarity, but also the difference, right? So for Schelling, the fact that there's a structural similarity of process does not mean that we have sameness of like products. It's not a reductionism. It's not a claim that everything in nature is the same. It's that difference can arise from the same process. So I think when we think in terms of that process, we can make sense of why there is a difference between human freedom, freedom of other parts of nature and the freedom of God, but we also get a way to think about the fact that they arise from the same process. And that's it. Thank you. Thanks.